My name is Annabel. I am 32 years old. I work in a small office. I live a quiet life. Then one morning, everything changed. A new man came to lead our office. His name was Farhan. He was 40 years old, calm and kind. He had a soft voice and an easy smile. When he walked into a room, people felt it. He made everyone feel seen. He made everyone feel safe. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I said good morning. I smiled. I went back to my desk. But slowly, without meaning to, I began to notice things. The way he remembered small details I had mentioned once. The way he asked how I was, and actually waited for the answer. When he looked at me, something moved inside my chest. Something I had no name for yet. Then one afternoon I saw it. A ring. Gold and quiet, sitting on his left hand. I had seen that hand many times before. But I had never looked. Not really. I looked now. And I could not stop looking. He was married. And I was already in love with him. I did not plan this. I did not choose this. But the heart does not ask permission. And now I had only one question. A question I was afraid to answer. What do I do with a love that has no place to go? Before I continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Again, my name is Annabel. I am 32 years old. I work in a small office in the middle of a city that never seems to notice me. And for a long time, I did not mind that. I had my desk. I had my routine. I had my small, predictable life. And I held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are afraid to examine too closely in case you find it wanting. Every morning I arrived at 8:15. Not 8. Not 8:30. 8:15 because that was what my body had decided years ago, and I had never thought to argue with it. I made my tea in the small kitchen at the back of the office. I carried it to my desk. I sat down, opened my computer, and began. The work was not exciting. It was not meant to be. It was the kind of work that keeps the world running quietly in the background. Spreadsheets, schedules, correspondence, records. Nobody thanked you for it. Nobody noticed when it was done. But nobody noticed when anything went wrong either, and I had decided long ago that invisibility was its own kind of peace. I liked my colleagues well enough. There was Margaret, who kept photographs of her grandchildren lined along the edge of her monitor and offered biscuits every Friday without fail. There was Colin, who talked too much about football and too little about anything else but meant no harm by it. There was Priya, who was sharp and funny and the only person in the office who ever made me laugh out loud. Really laugh, the kind that surprises you. We were not close, exactly. But we were familiar. And familiar, I had learned, was enough. My life outside the office was quieter still. I lived alone in a flat on the 3rd floor of a building with a broken lift that nobody ever seemed to fix. I cooked simple meals. I read in the evenings. On weekends I walked, long, unhurried walks through whatever part of the city I had not yet worn out, and I told myself this was contentment. I told myself I was fine. Most of the time I believed it. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was not sitting at my desk each morning counting the hours or lying awake at night aching for something I could not name. I was simply still, like water in a glass that no one has touched. Calm on the surface, not going anywhere. And then Farhan arrived. He came on a Monday. A new director, we had been told. Someone brought in from another branch to lead our department. There had been murmurs for weeks, the kind of low, cautious office gossip that travels through a building like a draft under a door. Some people were nervous. Some were curious. I was neither particularly. I had seen managers come and go. I had learned not to invest too much in the arrival of someone new. But Farhan was not what any of us expected. He walked in that first morning without ceremony. No grand entrance, no stiff formality, no performance of authority. He was tall, with dark eyes that moved around the room with genuine attention rather than the glazed sweep of someone who has already decided what they think. He carried himself quietly, not the quiet of someone who is unsure of themselves, but the quiet of someone who has nothing to prove. He smiled at Margaret first, and the smile was real. He asked Colin something about the building where the stairs were, I think, and actually listened to the answer. When he passed my desk, he paused. "Annabel," he said, reading my name from the small card on my monitor. "Yes," I said. "I'm Farhan. It's good to meet you." He said it simply, without performance. Then he moved on. That was all. That was the whole of it. And yet I found myself sitting very still for a moment after he passed, as though something in the air had shifted almost imperceptibly, and my body had registered it before my mind had caught up. I told myself it was nothing. In those first weeks, I watched him the way you watch something without meaning to, the way your eyes find a candle in a dark room not because you're searching for it, but because light draws the eye and there is nothing you can do about that. He was kind to everyone. Not performatively kind, not the managed warmth of someone working through a leadership manual, but genuinely, naturally kind in a way that made people around him soften without noticing they were doing it. He remembered things. He remembered that Margaret's eldest granddaughter had a school play on the Thursday of his second week, and he asked her how it went on the Friday. He remembered that Colin had mentioned a problem with a supplier and followed up without being asked. Small things. Ordinary things. But the kind of ordinary things that most people forget, because most people are too occupied with themselves to hold space for the details of other people's lives. I noticed all of this from my desk. I noticed it the way you notice the weather. Not because you have decided to pay attention, but because it is simply there, present and undeniable, changing the quality of the air around you. He did not pay me any particular attention in those early weeks. I was one of several people in the office, and I gave him no special reason to notice me. I did my work. I answered his questions when he had them. I said good morning and good evening, and occasionally offered the kind of mild, functional comment that fills the spaces between real conversation. He was always warm in return, but then he was warm with everyone. I told myself this meant nothing. I told myself I was simply observing, the way a quiet person observes, cataloging details, noting patterns, filing things away. I told myself the small lift I felt each morning when I heard his voice down the corridor was merely the novelty of something new in an otherwise unchanging routine. That it would pass. That in another month or two, he would become simply part of the furniture of the office, like Margaret's photographs and the broken lift and the tea I made at 8:15 every morning without variation. I told myself all of this very firmly. But the truth I was not yet ready to say out loud, not even to myself in the quiet of my flat at night, was that something had shifted in me. Something small and stubborn and impossible to locate precisely, like a pebble in a shoe that you cannot find no matter how carefully you search. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of feeling that announces itself. It was simply there, lodged somewhere beneath the surface of my ordinary days, changing the temperature of things slightly. He was my boss. He was a colleague. He was a new presence in a familiar place, and it was natural, I reasoned, to be aware of someone new. Natural to notice someone who moved through a room the way he did, with that particular unhurried warmth, that quiet attentiveness that made you feel, when he spoke to you, that you were the only person in the building. Natural. Ordinary. Nothing at all to worry about. I made my tea at 8:15. I sat at my desk. I opened my computer, and began my work. Outside the window, the city went about its business, unhurried and indifferent. And across the office, Farhan looked up from whatever he was reading and caught my eye for just a moment, one brief, unremarkable moment, and smiled the way he smiled at everyone. I looked back at my screen. My heart, without my permission, did something it had not done in a very long time. It moved. It began with mornings. I had never been someone who looked forward to mornings. They had always been something to move through. The alarm, the shower, the tea, the walk to the office, the sitting down, the beginning again. Functional. Necessary. Not unpleasant, but not something you anticipated. Not something that pulled you forward through the night toward it. But somewhere in the weeks after Farhan arrived, mornings changed. I would wake and lie still for a moment in the gray light of my flat, and before I had consciously thought anything at all, something in me would already be leaning toward the day. Not toward any specific thing I could name. Not toward a meeting or a task or a plan. Just forward. Into the day. Into the office. Into whatever unremarkable sequence of hours would eventually place me in the same building as him. I noticed this, and I did not examine it too closely. I was good at not examining things too closely. I began to pay attention to sounds in a way I never had before. The particular sound of the main door opening in the morning. Footsteps in the corridor, their weight, their rhythm, whether they were hurried or unhurried. His were always unhurried, measured and calm, the walk of someone who has decided not to be rushed by the world. I knew them before I saw him. I would hear them coming down the corridor, and something in my chest would do a small, involuntary thing, a tightening, a lift, and then he would appear in the doorway and say good morning to the room, and I would look at my screen and say good morning back along with everyone else, and no one would know that my heart had just rearranged itself slightly. He passed my desk most mornings on his way to his office. It was simply the layout of the room. My desk sat between the door and the corridor that led to the smaller offices at the back. He would have passed anyone sitting there. It was geography, nothing more. But I had begun, without deciding to look up at precisely the right moment. Not eagerly. Not obviously. Just up. As though I had happened to glance in that direction for no particular reason. He always noticed. He always smiled. Morning, Annabel. Morning. 2 words. Sometimes 3 if one of us remarked on the weather or the day. And then he was gone, and I would turn back to my screen, and the morning would continue exactly as it always had. Except that it didn't, not really. Because there was now a small warmth at the center of it that had not been there before, and I carried it through the rest of the day like something cupped in both hands, carefully, without looking at it directly, trying not to think about what it meant. I told myself it was simply pleasant, that it was nice to work somewhere with a kind atmosphere, that this was what a good manager did, made people feel at ease, made the ordinary days feel slightly more bearable. I was not unusual in responding to that. Everyone in the office seemed lighter since he arrived. Margaret smiled more. Even Colin had stopped complaining about the heating. It was not about me specifically. It was not about anything specific at all. I was very convincing. And then one afternoon in the 4th week, I saw it. He was standing at the printer near my desk, waiting for something to come through, and he was reading something on his phone with one hand while the other rested against the top of the machine. I was not staring. I want to be clear about that. I was simply looking up from my work at the precise moment that the light from the window caught the gold band on the 4th finger of his left hand. I had seen his hands before, many times, but I had not seen that. I looked away immediately. I looked back at my screen. I read the same line of text 4 times without taking in a single word. He was married. Of course, he was married. He was 40 years old and kind and warm, and the sort of man who remembered the details of other people's lives. Of course, someone had found him first. Of course, there was someone at home waiting for him, someone who heard those unhurried footsteps every evening returning to her instead of disappearing into the city. Of course. I told myself it did not matter because it did not need to matter because nothing had happened. Nothing was happening. I had a small, manageable warmth that I carried carefully through my mornings, and that was all it was and all it needed to be, and the ring on his finger changed nothing because there was nothing to change. I told myself this very calmly and very thoroughly. The printer finished. He gathered his pages. He glanced over and caught me looking, or almost looking at the space near him rather than at him, and he smiled. "Nearly the end of the day," he said pleasantly. "Nearly," I said. He went back to his office. The door closed softly behind him. I sat at my desk and did not move for a long moment. Outside the window the city went on as it always did, indifferent and unhurried, and I sat very still inside the quiet of the office and felt something settle over me that I could not quite call sadness. Not yet. But that was heavier than anything I had felt in a long time. Not broken. Not devastated. Just heavy. Very, very heavy. There are things you keep because you have no choice. Secrets that are not really secrets. Not in the dramatic sense. Not the kind that carry weight and consequence and the threat of exposure, but simply truths that belong only to you, that you hold close not out of shame exactly, but out of a kind of self-preservation. A knowledge that if you said it out loud, even once, even to someone you trusted, it would become real in a different way. It would have edges. It would take up space. And then you would have to decide what to do with it. I told no one. Not Priya, who sat 2 desks away and noticed everything, and would have listened without judgment. Not Margaret, who was warm and discreet and had probably held more of other people's quiet griefs than anyone in that office knew. Not anyone. I held it the way I held most things, carefully, privately, in the part of myself that I had always kept separate from the rest of my life. The part that did not show on my face. The part that got me through. And so on the surface, nothing changed. I arrived at 8:15. I made my tea. I sat at my desk and did my work and said good morning to the room when Farhan came in and good evening when the day ended. I was pleasant and professional and entirely unremarkable, and if there was something moving beneath all of that, something slow and stubborn and impossible to fully quiet, no one could see it. But I could feel it. Every day, a little more. The meetings were the hardest. We had a team meeting every Tuesday morning. 12 of us around a long table, Farhan at the head, a screen at the far end showing whichever report or update or agenda item we had moved on to. I sat toward the middle, which meant I had a clear, unobstructed view of him, and I had learned very quickly that this was a problem. I tried. I genuinely tried to look at the screen. I would fix my eyes on whatever was being presented, figures, timelines, action points, and follow along and take notes and contribute when I was expected to contribute. But then he would speak, and my eyes would move without my permission, drawn by the sound of his voice the way a compass needle is drawn by north. Not dramatically, just steadily, reliably every time. And I would find myself watching his face instead of the presentation, the way he listened when someone else was speaking, with his full attention leaning forward slightly, his pen turning slowly between his fingers. The way a small line appeared between his brows when he was working through something complicated. The way he smiled when someone made a good point, quickly and genuinely, as if he could not help it. I took very thorough notes in those meetings. I had to give my hands something to do. Afterwards, I would walk back to my desk and feel faintly ashamed of myself, Not for anything I had done, but for the quality of my own attention, for the way it kept escaping toward him, no matter how firmly I tried to keep it where it belonged. I was a grown woman. I was 32 years old with a job and a flat and a reasonable life. I was not a person who lost herself in things she could not have. I had always been too sensible for that. Too contained. Too careful. And yet, the weeks moved on, and the feeling did not diminish the way I had been certain it would. If anything, it grew quieter and more settled, the way a river in winter slows and deepens rather than disappearing. I stopped waiting for it to pass. I started, instead, simply managing it, learning to carry it without letting it show. This, at least, I was competent at. And then came the afternoon in the third week of November. It was a Thursday. The office was quiet. Several people were out at a client visit, and the remaining few were working steadily at their desks. I had been having trouble with my computer for most of the morning. A spreadsheet I needed had become corrupted somehow, the formatting unraveling in ways I could not fix, and by 2 o'clock I had spent more time on the problem than I could justify and was still no closer to a solution. Farhan appeared at my shoulder without announcement. "You've been frowning at that for a while," he said, not unkindly. "Can I take a look?" I moved back from the screen slightly. He leaned in, standing close beside me, closer than the usual professional distance that people maintain in offices without thinking about it, close in the way that becomes necessary when two people are looking at the same small screen. His forearm was near my shoulder. I could feel the warmth of him, that particular proximity that is entirely ordinary and entirely impossible to ignore. He reached across me toward the keyboard. His hand moved to the mouse and made a few quick adjustments, and then he said something about the formatting and pointed at the screen, and I nodded and tried to concentrate on what he was showing me. I understood perhaps half of it. The other half I lost entirely, because at that precise moment his hand shifted back from the mouse and crossed over mine. Not deliberately, not meaningfully, simply the accidental geography of two people occupying the same small space, and the back of his hand brushed the back of mine, cool and brief and completely unintentional. I did not move. I did not breathe, not fully. I felt heat rise to my face with a swiftness that appalled me, a warmth that began at my jaw and spread upward, and I was suddenly intensely, desperately aware of whether it was visible, whether he could see it, whether the quality of my stillness had changed in some way that a perceptive person might notice. He noticed. He glanced at me, just a glance, brief and mild, and said, "Sorry, are you all right? Am I in your way?" "No," I said. My voice came out evenly. I was grateful for that. "I'm fine. Thank you." He looked at me for just a half-second longer than necessary. Not suspiciously. Not with any particular meaning. Just the natural pause of someone checking that the answer they received matches the person who gave it. Then he straightened up and pointed at the screen once more and explained what he had done, and I nodded in the right places, and he said to let him know if it happened again, and then he was gone, back to his office, unhurried, uncomplicated, entirely unaware. I sat very still. My face was still warm. My hand, where his had touched it, felt different, not painfully, not dramatically, but different, the way a surface feels different after something has passed over it. I pressed my palm flat against the desk and stared at the corrected spreadsheet and breathed slowly and told myself, with great firmness, that I was fine. I was not fine. I was a woman sitting at a desk in a quiet office on a Thursday afternoon in November, holding a feeling I had no right to and nowhere to put it, telling myself with less and less conviction that it would pass, that it meant nothing, that I was too sensible and too careful and too controlled to let something like this take hold of me. I was not fine at all, but I straightened my back. I picked up my pen. I looked at the spreadsheet and began to work through it, line by careful line, the way I had always worked through difficult things, methodically, quietly, without letting any of it show on my face. Outside the window, the afternoon light was thinning toward evening. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. Someone put the kettle on in the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of the office moved around me like water around a stone, and I sat at the center of it all, perfectly still on the surface, and felt the current beneath. I told no one. I never told anyone. It had been a difficult morning, though I could not have explained precisely why. Sometimes difficulty is like that. It does not arrive with a reason attached. It simply settles over the day like a change in weather, a low pressure that sits behind your eyes and makes everything slightly harder than it needs to be. I had made 2 errors in correspondence that I never normally made. I had read the same email 3 times and still could not retain what it said. I had sat at my desk and felt, with quiet persistence, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time without telling anyone. I was managing. I was always managing. But that morning, managing felt like more effort than usual. I did not notice Farhan approach. I was looking at my screen with a fixed, effortful concentration of someone trying to outwork their own distraction, and then there was a presence beside me. Not behind me, not across the room, but beside me, close and unhurried. And I looked up, and he was there, pulling out the empty chair from the adjacent desk and sitting down in it with the easy, unassuming manner of someone who has not considered that his presence might disrupt anything. "You've been very quiet today," he said. It was not an accusation. It was not even really an observation in the probing sense. It was simply something he had noticed and chosen to say, in the same way he might have noted that the weather had turned or that the afternoon had gone quickly. Gentle, matter of fact, as though noticing me was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm all right," I said. The same answer I always gave, reliable as a reflex. He did not push. He did not offer the usual suite of responses, the cheerful redirect, the practical suggestion, the polite acceptance that allows both parties to move on. He simply sat for a moment, as though he had nowhere particular to be and no pressing reason to fill the silence, and I felt the strange, disarming quality of being in the presence of someone who is genuinely comfortable with quiet. Then he said, "You know, I've noticed something about you since I started here." I looked at him. I could not help it. "You do a lot for this team," he said, quietly, without making anything of it. "When something needs doing, it gets done, and half the time I suspect it's because you've already seen it coming and dealt with it before anyone else noticed." He paused. "You don't say much in meetings, but when you do, it matters. People listen, even if they don't always realize they're doing it." I did not know what to do with this. I sat very still and looked at him and felt something move through me that I had no adequate word for, a warmth that was also a kind of pain, the way something long cold feels when heat is first applied to it. "You're quietly strong," he said. "That's rarer than people think." He said it simply, without flourish, the way you state something that is plainly and obviously true. And then, and this was the part one would return to, over and over, in the hours that followed, he said, "You're special, Annabel. I hope you know that." Special. I had been called many things over the course of my life. Capable, reliable, sensible, the kind of quiet, functional words that describe a person who does what is required and does not cause difficulty. Kind words, some of them. Useful words. But not that one. Never quite that one. Not like this. Not said in that particular way, with that particular quality of attention, by someone looking at me as though they were seeing something they genuinely valued. I smiled. I held his gaze for exactly the right amount of time, and I smiled, and I said something, I cannot remember precisely what, something modest and deflecting, the kind of response that accepts a compliment without making too much of it, and he smiled back and then rose from the chair and said he would let me get on, and he went back to his office, and the door closed quietly behind him. I turned back to my screen.
My hands were still in my lap.
I looked down at them as though they belonged to someone else. Then I placed them on the keyboard, and I worked. I worked steadily and carefully for the rest of the afternoon, through the slow drain of the remaining hours, through the gradual emptying of the office as people gathered their things and left for the evening. I said goodbye to Margaret. I said goodnight to Priya. I shut down my computer, put on my coat, and walked home through the cold November air with my hands in my pockets and my face tilted slightly downward against the wind. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my flat. I unlocked the door. I hung up my coat. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands before making dinner, as I always did, and I caught my own reflection in the mirror above the sink, and I stopped. I stood there, and I looked at myself for a long moment, at my ordinary face, at my quiet, contained, unremarkable face, which was the face of a woman who managed and endured and held things carefully and never made a fuss. He thinks I am special. The thought arrived simply, without drama. And then, without warning and without my permission, my eyes filled with tears. I did not try to stop them. I stood in front of the mirror in my small bathroom, and I cried, really cried, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and releases something you did not know you had been holding. I cried because something in me had been seen, and it was beautiful. I cried because the person who had seen it could never be mine, and that was devastating. I cried because both of these things were true at exactly the same time, and there was no resolving them, no choosing one over the other.
Happy. Heartbroken.
Both at once. I went to the park on Saturday because I needed air. That was what I told myself. Air and open sky, and the simple, uncomplicated relief of being somewhere that was not my flat and not my office and not the inside of my own head, which had become, in recent weeks, a rather exhausting place to spend time. It was a cold morning but bright, the kind of winter day that feels like a concession. Here, the sky seems to say, I cannot give you warmth, but I will give you this light, this clean, pale light that makes everything look freshly considered. I walked for a while without direction and then found a bench near the edge of the path that ran alongside the tree line, and I sat down and turned my face up toward the sun and closed my eyes. I was trying not to think about anything. I was trying, for once, simply to be still. Not the managed stillness of the office, the performed composure of a woman holding herself carefully together in a public place, but something more genuine than that. Something restful. I listened to the park around me. Children somewhere in the middle distance. A dog moving through leaves. The low, steady sound of the city beyond the trees, muted and unthreatening from here, like something heard through water. My mind began, very slowly, to loosen, and then I heard his voice. I knew it before I understood that I knew it, the way you recognize a piece of music from the first 2 notes, before your conscious mind has caught up and named it. Something in me responded to the sound of it with an immediacy that bypassed thought entirely. My eyes opened. He was perhaps 20 feet away, on the path that curved in from the east entrance. He was looking down at his phone and speaking to someone beside him, and he was smiling, relaxed and unguarded in the way that people are when they are entirely at home in their surroundings, when they have nothing to perform and nowhere to be, but exactly where they are. The woman beside him was smiling too. She was tall, with dark hair pulled loosely back, and she walked with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone comfortable in their own life. She was saying something I could not hear, and he was laughing at it, really laughing, his head tilting back slightly, and the sight of it did something to me that I was not prepared for. Not jealousy, not exactly. Something quieter and more desolate than that. The recognition of a version of him I had never seen before and would never have access to. Then the boy appeared. He came running from somewhere behind them, 4 or 5 years old, coat half unzipped and flying, making the particular joyful noise of a small child who has briefly escaped adult supervision and finds this enormously funny. He ran directly at Farhan, and Farhan caught him without breaking stride. One fluid, practiced movement, swinging the boy up and then setting him down again with a naturalness that spoke of 1,000 repetitions, of years of this, of a life built around these small, ordinary moments. The girl came next. Younger, perhaps 3, moving with the determined, unsteady urgency of someone whose legs have not quite caught up with her intentions. She reached him and grabbed his hand with both of hers, and Farhan stopped walking and looked down at her, and something in his face changed, softened into something so unguarded and so complete that I had to look away. I did not look away quickly enough. He crouched down and lifted her, this small, serious girl, and she put her arms around his neck with the total unself-conscious trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt that she will be held. And he kissed the top of her head gently without thinking about it, the way you do something you have done so many times it has become part of you. And then he stood and the woman beside him touched his arm briefly, and they walked on together, the 4 of them, moving down the path away from me and toward whatever the rest of their Saturday held. I did not move. I sat on my bench with my hands in my lap, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound. He had not seen me. I was aware of this with a relief so intense it was almost physical, the relief of someone who has narrowly avoided something they cannot name, but instinctively understand, would have been unbearable. I turned my face toward the trees. The bark was dark with winter damp. A bird moved somewhere in the upper branches. I fixed my eyes on a particular point in the middle distance, and I breathed, slowly and deliberately, the way you breathe when breathing is something you have to consciously decide to do. I did not cry. I held it all very tightly inside my chest, and I did not cry. They were long gone by the time I finally moved. The park had shifted around me, different people on the paths now, different dogs, different children. The light had changed, grown flatter. Some time had passed. I was not sure how much. I stood up slowly. I put my hands in my pockets. I walked home the long way, not because I had intended to, but because turning toward home directly felt like more decision than I was capable of just then, and so I simply walked through the cold and the thin winter light, and I let the city move around me, and I thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its finality, that I understood now. I understood completely. He had a life. A whole, full, real life. A woman who made him laugh on Saturday mornings, children who ran to him with their arms open. A life so complete and so inhabited that there was no space in it, not even the smallest space, that was waiting to be filled. Not by me. Not by anyone. I walked home, and I said nothing, and I told no one, and I held the knowledge quietly inside me, where I kept everything else. And I understood at last what I was carrying and why it was so heavy, and why it would not be put down. I did not sleep well on Sunday night. I lay in the dark and watched the ceiling and listened to the buildings settle around me and told myself, with diminishing conviction, that I was fine. That Monday would come, and I would go to work and sit at my desk and everything would continue exactly as it always had, because nothing had changed. Nothing had happened. I had simply sat on a bench in a park and watched a man with his family on a Saturday morning, and that was all it was, and it meant nothing that I had not already known. I believed almost none of this by the time my alarm went off. I got up because there was no alternative. I moved through the morning routine with the careful, effortful deliberateness of someone performing a series of actions they have forgotten the purpose of: the shower, the tea, the coat, the door. The walk to the office felt longer than usual. The air felt colder. I kept my eyes on the pavement, and I did not think about anything, or I tried not to, which is a different thing entirely. I arrived at 8:15. I made my tea. I sat down. I did not look up when the main door opened. I did not listen for footsteps in the corridor. I looked at my screen and I worked, or I approximated working, moving through the motions of it, opening files and reading words that did not fully reach me, and I kept my head down and my face neutral, and I asked nothing of the morning except that it pass. He came to my desk just before 10. I sensed him before I saw him, the way I always did, and I felt my shoulders tighten slightly with the effort of composing myself. He stopped beside my desk and did not say anything immediately, and when I looked up he was watching me with that particular quality of attention he had, calm and unhurried, as though he had set aside whatever else he was carrying in order to be fully present in this one moment. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "You seem—" He paused, choosing carefully. "Far away today." "I'm just tired," I said. "I didn't sleep well." He nodded slowly. He looked at me a moment longer. Not intrusively, not with any pressure behind it, simply with a kind of genuine and unhurried concern that he made no effort to conceal, and then he said, "Make sure you're taking care of yourself." Simple words. Ordinary words. The kind of thing a decent person says to a colleague who looks worn down on a Monday morning. I smiled and thanked him, and he moved on, and I turned back to my screen, and I sat very still and felt the kindness of it move through me like something that was supposed to soothe but instead found every tender place and pressed there, gently, without meaning to. It would have been easier if he were cruel, if he were cold or careless or oblivious. I could have managed that. I had managed harder things, but he was not any of those things. He was exactly what he had always been, warm and attentive and genuine, and that, I was discovering, was the most difficult thing of all to bear. It happened on a Thursday evening, quietly, the way the most significant things always seem to happen, without announcement, without preparation, arriving simply because the conditions were right and there was no longer anywhere for it to go except out into the open. Everyone else had left by 6:30. I had stayed because there was a report that needed finishing before Friday morning, and I had been unable to concentrate on it properly for most of the week, which meant Thursday evening was the reckoning I had made for myself. I heard the others leave in ones and twos, the gathering of coats, the brief exchanges at the door, the small sounds of a working day ending. And then the office was quiet, and I was alone in it, or I thought I was, until I heard the lights still on down the corridor, and understood that Farhan was still there too. I did not go to him. I stayed at my desk and worked, or tried to, and told myself that in 20 minutes I would be finished, and I would put on my coat and leave, and that would be the end of it. A Thursday evening. Nothing more. He appeared in the doorway at 6:45. He had his jacket off, his sleeves pushed up, and he looked tired in a way I had not seen before, not overwhelmed, but quietly worn, as though the day had taken something from him that he had not quite recovered. He looked at me across the empty office, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then he walked over, not to his desk, to mine. He sat down in the chair beside me. The same chair he had pulled out on that difficult morning weeks ago, and he rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment before looking at me. And I knew, with a certainty that arrived before any words did, that something was about to change. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I'm not sure I should, but I think I've run out of ways not to." I waited. My hands were very still in my lap. "You matter to me," he said, "more than is straightforward, more than I know what to do with." He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he said everything, as though the truth were simply the truth and there was no particular virtue in dressing it differently. "I think about you, more than I should, more than I have any right to." The room was very quiet around us. The lights in the main office had dimmed to their after-hours setting, and the city outside the windows was doing what it always did, entirely indifferent to what was happening inside this particular building on this particular evening. "You make me feel," he started again. "There is something about being near you that makes me feel like myself, like a version of myself I had stopped expecting to find." He looked at me steadily. "I don't know what to do with that. I don't have an answer for it. I only know it's true." My eyes had filled with tears. I was aware of this with a distant, helpless clarity, the blurring at the edges of things, the heat behind my eyes, and I did not try to stop it because I did not have the resources left to manage everything at once. I had been managing for so long. I was so tired of managing. Part of me wanted to say nothing, to simply sit inside this moment and let it be what it was, to let his words exist in the air between us without responding, without resolving, because as long as nothing was said in return it could remain possible. Unfinished. A door not yet closed. But I knew what was on the other side of that door. I had seen it on a Saturday morning in a park, in the face of a woman who made him laugh, and in the arms of a small girl who held him with total and unquestioning trust. I had seen his real life, and his real life was complete. "Farhan," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was steady. I was grateful for that. "I hear you." And I stopped, began again. "What you've said is not nothing to me." "It is not nothing at all." He watched me. "But I've seen your family," I said. "I saw you in the park. I saw your children." I paused. "I cannot be the reason that breaks. I won't be, even if I wanted to, and I am not going to tell you that I could not live with being that reason. I'm not able to be something that costs other people everything." He did not argue. He did not push back or try to reframe or offer any of the justifications that I think part of me, the frightened, hopeful part, had been half expecting. He simply looked at me for a long moment with something in his face that I could not fully name, something that was sorrow and respect in equal measure. And then he nodded slowly once. "I understand," he said. And then we were quiet. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, exactly, but it was full, dense with everything that had been said, and everything that would never be said, everything that was true between us, and everything that could not be acted on. The room felt cold. The city moved beyond the glass. Somewhere in the building something clicked and settled. After a while he stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at me once more, just once, briefly, with that same quality of seeing that had undone me from the very beginning, and then he walked back down the corridor to his office. I sat alone in the dim light, and I did not move for a long time. There was nothing left to hope for. And somehow, in the wreckage of that, there was also something that felt almost like solid ground, the cold, quiet relief of a thing finally named and finally, gently, laid to rest. Life continued. This was the thing about ordinary life. It continued regardless, indifferent to whatever had shifted inside you, requiring the same things of you on a Friday that it had required on a Monday, offering no allowance for the quiet devastations that happened in dimly lit offices on Thursday evenings when everyone else had gone home. I arrived at 8:15. I made my tea.
I sat at my desk. Farhan arrived.
He said good morning to the room. He said good morning to me, my name, the same as always, the same warm, unhurried tone. And I said good morning back, and that was all, and we both returned to the business of the day. Polite. Professional. Entirely impeccably normal. We had not discussed what to do with the space between us. We had not needed to. It had simply appeared, that careful distance, as though we had both understood without negotiation what was required now. How close was too close, how much eye contact was too much, where the line was that kept everything manageable and allowed us both to continue functioning in the same room without it costing more than we could afford. We observed it without acknowledging it. We were very good at it, both of us, in our different ways. The meetings continued. I looked at the screen now. Mostly. The mornings continued. I stopped listening for his footsteps quite so acutely. Or I tried to. Some mornings I managed better than others. What surprised me was how much of the weight remained. I had half expected that the confession, the naming of it, the quiet and mutual laying down of something neither of us could carry properly, I had expected that to bring some relief. And it had, in the way that lancing a wound brings relief, immediate, practical, accompanied by a pain of its own. The infection was out, but the healing, I was discovering, was slow and unglamorous and happened mostly in the evenings alone, in the quiet of my flat, where there was no performance required and no composure to maintain. I thought in those evenings about what love actually costs when it has nowhere to go. Not the love you speak out loud. That kind has its own costs, its own particular grief and joy, its negotiations and compromises and risks. I mean the other kind, the kind you carry silently, that no one sees, that leaves no mark on the surface of your life that anyone could point to. That kind, I was learning, has a cost too, quieter, more cumulative, paid in small daily installments that seem manageable until you stop and look at the total. The hiding, the constant, effortful hiding, not of anything you have done, but of what you feel, which is in some ways more exhausting because feeling is involuntary and concealing it requires a continuous act of will. Every morning, every meeting, every good morning and good evening and perfectly calibrated exchange in the corridor. The hoping, the particular erosion of hope that does not die cleanly but lingers in a diminished form, surfacing at inconvenient moments, when he laughed at something across the office, when his voice carried down the corridor, when she caught herself, still, after everything, leaning slightly toward the sound of him before she caught herself and straightened. And beneath all of it, the slow, barely perceptible erosion of yourself. The way you become, over time, a slightly smaller version of who you might have been, not dramatically, not in any way that announces itself, but in the accumulated weight of all the things you swallowed and all the space you made yourself take up less of in order to contain something that had no proper place to live. I sat with all of this in the evenings, and I did not look away from it. I thought it was important not to look away, to see it clearly, what it had been, what it had cost, what it had asked of me, before I could decide what came next. Outside my window, the city moved through its own indifferent rhythms. Inside, I sat in the quiet and I looked at myself honestly, perhaps for the first time in a long time, and I began very slowly to think about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no single realization that arrived like light through a break in the clouds, no conversation that changed everything, No morning when she woke and found that the weight had lifted and the world looked different.
It was quieter than that.
Most real things are. It was a Tuesday evening in January. I was sitting in my flat with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside me and a book open in my lap that I had not been reading, and I became aware, with a sudden and very simple clarity, that I was waiting. That I had been waiting for a long time. Not for anything specific. Not for Farhan to change his mind. Not for circumstances to rearrange themselves into something more possible. Not for any particular thing I could have named if someone had asked me. Just waiting. Existing in a kind of suspension, one part of myself always held back, always oriented towards something I could not have, like a plant that has been growing toward a window that is never going to open.
I sat with this for a while.
I let myself see it clearly. And then, quietly, without ceremony, I decided to stop. Not because it stopped hurting. It still hurt. Not because I had stopped caring. I did not believe, sitting there on that Tuesday evening in January, that I would ever entirely stop caring, and I thought it was important to be honest with myself about that rather than pretend to a cleanliness of feeling that was not real. Farhan would always be somewhere in me. The months of noticing him, of carrying him quietly, of learning what it cost to love someone with no place to put it, that did not simply disappear because I had decided it should. The heart is not obedient in that way. But I could choose what I did with it. That much, I understood now, was mine. I had spent so long making myself small around this feeling, containing it, concealing it, managing it, working around it the way you work around a piece of furniture that is in the wrong place, but that you have stopped noticing because you have been stepping around it for so long. I had given it so much of my energy and my attention and my quiet evening hours, and I had given those things willingly, and I did not regret them exactly. But I was tired. I was tired in the particular way of someone who has been putting someone else at the center of their own life without being asked to, and without any possibility of return. I wanted the center back. I wanted it for myself. This sounds simpler than it was. In the weeks that followed, there were mornings when I heard his voice in the corridor and felt the old pull with an immediacy that made a mockery of every resolution I had made in the quiet of my flat. There were evenings when I sat alone and felt the absence of something I had never properly had, which is its own strange grief, the grief of an almost, of a thing that existed only in the interior, and left no external trace, but was no less real for that. I did not pretend these moments away. I let them come, and I let them pass, and I did not build anything on top of them. And slowly, not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly and genuinely, something began to shift. I started to notice things I had stopped noticing. The particular quality of winter light on a Sunday morning. The pleasure of a walk with no destination. The way Priya made me laugh, really laugh, in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Small things. My own things. Things that did not require anyone else in order to be good. I started to sleep better. I started to read again, properly. The words reaching me now instead of sliding past. I started to make plans. Modest ones, the kind that belong only to yourself. A weekend away somewhere I had not been, an evening class I had been considering for 2 years and never signed up for. I started, cautiously, and without making too much of it, to think about the future as something that belonged to me rather than something I was simply passing through on my way to a feeling that was never going to resolve. It was not a transformation. I want to be careful about that word. I was still myself, still quiet, still contained, still the woman who arrived at 8:15 and made her tea and did her work without fuss. But something in the quality of that quietness had changed. It felt chosen now rather than imposed. It felt like mine. Farhan and I remained professional. We remained polite. On the good days, I could sit in a meeting and listen to him speak and feel something that was almost peaceful, a recognition without longing, the way you feel about a place you have loved and left and made your peace with leaving. On the harder days, I simply worked through it, the way you work through most difficult things, steadily, without drama, 1 hour at a time. And at the end of those days, I went home. I climbed my 3 flights of stairs. I made my tea. I sat in my quiet flat, and I was simply there, present in my own life, in my own space, in my own carefully tended and genuinely inhabited self. It was enough. More than enough. I was beginning to understand exactly where I was supposed to be.